The weather that Saturday was as bad as it had been 3 years before. The sky was gray and gloomy. A drizzle made one wrap up under a blanket and never left it. The air was filled with a ghost of sadness. All this made Thomas, already dejected, uneasy, and torn from his subconscious mind, his most intimate memories, followed by a sharp and stabbing pain. That pain was the realization of a fatal mistake, a mistake that had caused him to lose everything. 3 years ago, he and his pregnant wife, Betty, and 8-year-old daughter, Gwen, had moved to his mother's house outside the city to a small community he had not visited in 10 years. That's how many years had passed since his mother's death. She had had mental illness for a long time, especially in the last months of her life. Now, only an old vase of ashes reminded Thomas of his mother. The move was the bullying of his daughter at school. She was a withdrawn child and had speech problems, which caused her to be constantly attacked by her peers. Thomas and Betty decided that the atmosphere away from the city would suit their daughter's health and that schools with fewer students would make bullying less likely. There would be no problem with work since Thomas's high salary would easily cover the costs of fuel to get into town. They moved, and they were right. Gwen's emotional state improved. She smiled more, and at times it seemed that her speech problems also became less noticeable. To her parents' surprise, she went out for a walk every day in the yard before taking her favorite toy, a stuffed rabbit, Bunny. So exactly 1 month has passed. Her daughter's birthday was 2 days away. Betty went to the store to get groceries and gifts for the party, and as she approached the register, she overheard other customers talking about a family that lives in a long-abandoned village. Interesting news, Betty thought as she laid out the merchandise at the register. Thomas and his daughter were home at the time. Everything seemed fine then. Only the weather dampened the mood of the family members. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and a solid and chilly wind was blowing. Despite this, Gwen once again asked to go for a walk around the house. Thomas looked out the window, then at his daughter, and said with a smirk, "You decided to get sick right before your birthday. You better stay home. Mom will be home soon. Please, Dad. I'll only be 10 minutes. I promise," Gwen said with her typical childlike intonation. The father looked into his daughter's eyes, so sweet and good-natured, and involuntarily replied, "Okay, no more than 10 minutes, and dress warmer." Gwen left the house, taking her teddy friend with her, but she didn't return in 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or even an hour. The family's evening ended in tears, panic, and talking to the police. Saturday, the 11th of July, was drawing to a close. The search had yielded no results. Not the slightest clue had been found. The police made 2 assumptions. Either Gwen had been kidnapped, or she had fallen prey to wild animals. The latter was not unreasonable since the town was located near a forest. They could offer no other explanation for what had happened. The last thing the sheriff said was that he wanted to get out of that dangerous place as soon as possible. What had happened had broken Betty. The final straw was the miscarriage of the second child. The doctor said it was the result of extreme stress. She went into the bathroom, filled the tub with warm water, and cut her wrists. Thomas has lived alone ever since. Henceforth, only grief, despair, and a desire to change everything filled the house that had once been teeming with life. The only thing that kept the unhappy man in this world was hope. He believed that his daughter would return, and that he could look into those sweet, childlike eyes again. Thomas visited Gwen's room daily, sat on her bed, and then looked out the window for a long time, hoping to see his happy, playing daughter in the yard. So it had been precisely 3 years since his daughter disappeared. So, putting all thoughts and memories aside, Thomas prepared to go to his wife's grave, visiting his daughter's room before doing so, as always. When he entered the room, he was filled with silent horror. On the bed lay Bunny, the stuffed rabbit that had gone missing with Gwen. However, the toy's condition had changed significantly. Dirt covered its soft shell, and in its place was a large hole with foam rubber sticking out. "I need to go outside, get some air," Thomas said aloud, then staggered out of the room. He sat on the bench outside the house for a long time, occasionally glancing at the window of his daughter's room. There, he saw the familiar silhouette. She looked into his eyes so profoundly that thousands of goosebumps covered Thomas's body, taking his ability to speak with them. He stood in a daze for a few more minutes, then rushed to run towards his daughter. However, when Thomas got to the room, neither his daughter nor the teddy bear was there. There was only a note with a mysterious runic inscription on it. Thomas immediately opened the first translator he could find on the internet and started typing in the description. When he saw the translation, he took a sedative and sleeping pills from the medicine cabinet and took a slightly higher dose than recommended. "You won't get your daughter back," the ominous inscription read. The unhappy father could not believe what was going on around him. "I imagine things. I need to get some sleep. Tomorrow it will turn out to be just a bad dream," Thomas said, and feeling the effects of the medicine, fell asleep in the chair. When he woke up, he checked if the ominous note was still there. Unfortunately for him, it was in the same place as yesterday. The shivers ran down his body again. Thomas sat down on his daughter's bed and tried to comprehend the connection between everything that had happened. His first urge was to go to the asylum, but the thought that what was happening might be real stopped him from making such a decision. Runes. What do the runes have to do with anything? Damn! At this rate, I'll end up like my mother, Thomas thought, suddenly realizing that he had just gotten a little closer to solving this mystery. He went down to the basement of the house and started going through his mother's old things. Then on his desk were already several books his mother had brought back from her trip to Finland. He began flipping through the pages of those books, one by one, and looking there for at least some clue. He sat like this until he was distracted by a knock at the front door. He shuddered. No guest had ever come to him before, especially at this time. He went to the door and looked at the intruder through the large window next to the entrance. His heart filled with wild terror again, and again he felt his strength leave him. Standing at the door was Gwen in tattered clothes, with a wounded face and fierce eyes, not at all like those he had seen on Saturday the 11th of July. Thomas hurried to turn on the streetlights, and what he saw triggered a new wave of primal fear. Under the streetlight stood a scrawny, 2-meter-long creature on 2 hooves. The creature's body was covered in short, thick fur, its ribs protruding from its chest, and its muzzle resembled that of a deer. Perhaps it was a deer, a monster deer. After turning on the light, the creature hurried away toward the woods. As soon as it disappeared, Thomas looked again to where his daughter had been standing a few seconds before, but no one was there. He did not hesitate to close the window with the curtains and hurried to do the same with all the windows in the house. After taking the same sedative, but in much smaller amounts, he rushed to continue his search for clues in the stack of books he had brought from the basement. Finally, he found what he was looking for. The book, shabby through the years, and the condition of the cellar was about ancient Scandinavia, about the mythology of that region. One page describes an evil spirit that the Finns called Missa. Missa could move into any object, including live beings. After possessing an inanimate object, the spirit transformed it into its own heart. Then Missa would move into a living being and stay there for 40 years. In this state, he could control other beings, including humans, changing their perception of reality. This was especially true of small children. After 40 years, the spirit had to change its heart by moving into another object. The cycle was closed. Only in the state of changing hearts could Missa be destroyed by getting rid of the old heart. After reading the correct page, Thomas began comparing his reading with reality. Mother, so she was under the influence of the spirit too? And we all thought she had lost her mind. Forgive me. Please forgive me, Thomas cried. It was necessary to find that heart, and Thomas was well aware of that. He started throwing everything his mother had brought from Scandinavia into the yard. There wasn't much stuff, but there was only one thought on Thomas's mind. Something's missing. After a moment's reflection, he realized what was causing the thought and quickly returned to the house, taking with him the vase that held his mother's ashes. He realized that he needed another container where he could pour the ashes, which caused Thomas to return to the house once more. As he entered the kitchen, he met his daughter again. She looked just as awful as she had looked when she stood at the door. Behind her on the floor was her favorite toy. There was one peculiar thing about Gwen now. She was holding a knife in her hand. "Gwen?" Thomas said with a shiver. "Tell me, where have you been all this time?" Instead of answering, however, Gwen lunged at her father with the knife, severely injuring her arm and stomach. Thomas pushed his daughter away, but she continued to try to kill her father. Thomas ran out into the street, where it was already standing there. That creature, or rather, the spirit that had inhabited the body of that unfortunate animal, significantly altering it. It let out a piercing roar, wheezed, and was about to run away again, not toward the woods, but directly toward Thomas. Thomas overcame his fear and ran toward the animal, but his target was not it, but the vase in his way. He managed to grab it with one hand and, without a second's hesitation, smashed it to the ground. His mother's ashes crumbled and were picked up by the wind, and the animal that a moment ago had run at Thomas with rage staggered and collapsed on the grass. But the most important thing that happened at that moment was the loud utterance of the phrase, "Daddy?" from Gwen's mouth. Thomas's daughter regained her memory and sanity. She approached her father and immediately passed out from exhaustion. While sighing in pain, Thomas carried his daughter to the car and, turning the ignition key, drove to the hospital. The village, which had seemed clean and comfortable yesterday, looked as if it had been abandoned for years. The road was broken up in some places. The houses were empty, with boarded-up windows, and the grounds around them were overgrown with tall bushes. It was as if no one had lived there for a long time. Thomas drove, constantly looking around, unable to believe what he saw. But he didn't care anymore, because in the back seat was his daughter, who had recently been presumed dead. He had found the meaning of life again and was never returning to that damned place. Thomas's story had a happy ending. His story, but not the story of the paranormal in that land. The stuffed rabbit, forgotten by his daughter, lay on the kitchen floor of their former home while the corpse of the deer had mysteriously disappeared. All that was left to do was to believe that the bunny rabbit would never fall into human hands again.